When we think about the Passover Seder, a lot of times I think we forget the Jewishness of Jesus. He was a Jew. He performed and practiced all the rituals that were part of the Jewish faith. And so he celebrated the Passover Seder. This was what this Last Supper was about. But we as Christians would call this Maundy Thursday. This night would be Maundy Thursday. So this is the meal, the defining meal that celebrates their release from the Egyptians and 400 years of slavery. It was their formative story that named their 40-year trek through the wilderness, where they became a nation. They birthed children and they discipled them along the way, and they formed a nation that would eventually be led into the Promised Land. And then, as a way of commemorating that, each year, the Passover is celebrated in Jewish homes. Many of you know that Joe Lubertini's husband, Paul Merith, is Jewish. And our disciple team got the opportunity a couple weeks ago to go celebrate a Sabbath meal with him and to hear some of his customs and practices as a Jew. And Roz Gann also came out of Jewish past. I think many of you all have celebrated a Passover Seder here at the church with them as they've walked us through it. This comes out of Exodus 12, and you heard Hamilton talk about what they were required to have at the meal, a sacrifice of roast lamb that was signifying the blood of a lamb that was spilt. They were to eat unleavened bread to remind them how quickly they had to flee to escape. They didn't have time to let the bread rise, so that's why they have the unleavened bread, the matzah, the flat crackers. Then they were to eat bitter herbs in memory of their deliverance from slavery to freedom. So what you have on the Seder plate are symbolic pieces. A good Seder would include chicken or brisket and vegetables and certainly glasses of wine, desserts, but there's always a symbolic plate that's there representing their escape from Egypt. You have the bitter herbs, horseradish or parsley. Those are dipped in salt water to remind us of the tears they shed through their journey. The haraset, which is a pureed apple mixture, which is kind of gritty, and it reminds them of the mortar that they used to build the bricks. An egg that celebrates new birth and life. Unleavened matzah, the haste with which they left. And the lamb that was slain, that, remember, they had to put over the doorpost of their home so that when Pharaoh passed over, their children would not be slaughtered. And then there were 4 cups of wine. 4 cups of wine that all were reminders and promises of Israel that had been redeemed. This is just here in the lower left-hand corner, not a very good picture, but an example of the symbolic elements on the Seder plate that we talked about, and then a typical Seder table in a Jewish home. How many of you have ever celebrated a Jewish Seder in someone's home? Have you ever done that? It's fascinating. We ought to really try to have Roz and Paul do something with that during this Lenten season. That would be fascinating if we've not waited too late. Now, there were 4 cups of wine, and I think it's really important for us to hear this. One was celebrated at the festival blessing at the very beginning of the Passover Seder. All would drink from the first cup. Then the second cup would be drank from as they read Psalm 113 and had prayers, the little Hallel, different prayers that they would offer during the Seder. During the main meal, then, they would eat their roasted lamb, the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs and spices. In a typical Seder, then, that would be the main part of their meal. And they would have the third cup, which is called the cup of blessing. Many people think that that is the cup that Jesus lifted in the Seder and transformed it into what we now understand as Holy Communion. Some would say it's the 4th cup that he actually took when we got to the very end of the Seder in closing, where the priest says, "It is finished," or "It is consummated." That's debated, whether it was the 3rd or 4th cup. But what is important to remember is that this 1 cup we have was one of 4 that he lifted out. And not following the Haggadah, which was the order of worship that they followed when they were doing a Seder, not following that at all, he lifted that and gave it a new meaning. Since he always spoke in parables and stories, it's likely they didn't really understand what he was doing. But he knew well that he was creating a new order and a new way of understanding that Passover Seder. Now, there's also in the Jewish Seder a 5th cup. Do you know what the 5th cup is? It's the cup of Elijah. where they leave the doors open of the house and they expect Elijah to return and come and sit at table with them. In the Christian understanding, Christ is the new Elijah. Where Elijah was one of the king prophets of Old Testament time, Christ in the New Testament is the new Elijah. So there was a fifth cup as well. Now, just a couple of insights about eating at the triclinium, not at that traditional Leonardo da Vinci table as we imagine. Isn't it amazing how one person's image can just form all of the images that we now have? But really, if you look at ancient Roman and Jewish practices, more than likely it was that triclinium. Judas at the left hand. That is fascinating. And I challenge you to do more reading on that and see if you can find that in some of your research. I want to do some more of it on myself. And then Rabbi Katz talked about how Jewish folk need to know this story because it is their defining story. And in the Haggadah, in the order of a Jewish Seder, one of the most fascinating things to me is the children always ask this question, why is this night different than any other night? And then the parents, the adults, proceed to tell the whole story. Did you hear her say in her home, a good Passover Seder would start at 7 and would not end till midnight? It's a long meal, but most of it is conversation about their freedom from slavery and the whole journey that they took. Just some questions to think about. Now, I think for us as Christians, then, it's important to understand how Holy Communion grew out of the Seder. And it grew out when Jesus did take that third or fourth cup and redefined it as, this is my blood of the new covenant poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. So no longer was it the blood of a lamb, it became the blood of the Lamb.